So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second event in our IBC and Commerce Bank Keynote Speaker Series for 2020 and 2021. I'm George Clark. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Western Hemispheric Trade in TAMIU's A.R. Sanchez Jr. School of Business. Our center, with the support from IBC Bank and Commerce Bank, brings speakers virtually this year due to the COVID epidemic to talk about a variety of different topics in the areas of international trade, economics, finance, and demography. Before introducing our today's speaker, I want to thank our sponsors for supporting this event, IBC and Commerce Bank. With their support, we've been able to bring many thought-provoking speakers throughout the years to TAMIU and Laredo, either virtually or in person. For the students here, there'll be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If you can submit your questions through the chat feature, I will try to ask the speaker as many of your questions as I possibly can. Today's speaker is Dr. Melissa Kearney. Dr. Kearney is the Neil Moskovich Professor of Economics at the University of Maryland. She's also the director of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. She has authored many influential economic articles in areas related to poverty, inequality, and social policy. Today, she'll be talking about how the COVID-19 pandemic and associated recession will have a lasting and negative effect on families. She'll also discuss the effect that the pandemic will have on fertility, placing her work in the broader economic literature on this topic. Thank you, Dr. Kearney.
So thank you so much for having me and inviting me to give this talk. So as mentioned, I'm going to talk about what I've been calling the coming COVID baby bust and some other challenges for families during this pandemic. So I just want to set the scene to get started. Obviously, we all know there's a terrible public health crisis and associated recession happening right now. I just want to pull out a few key features as I see them to make sure we're all on the same page with how we're thinking about the way families are experiencing this COVID-19 pandemic. So around February or March of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic takes off in the US. Mid-March, it's declared a national emergency for our country. And immediately there was tremendous job loss. So last March and April, 25 million workers lost their jobs. Now, about half of those jobs have returned, as we would expect in a normal recession and recovery, but we're still 10 million jobs short as compared to February. So we still have a very deep amount of job loss on account of the pandemic. Another way of looking at that issue is to look at official unemployment statistics. So before the pandemic, last February, our unemployment number was 3.5%. That shot up to an astounding 14.7% in April. And again, people have been returning to work, so the unemployment number has come down. The official statistic this month is 6.9%, but we know some people who are still out of work just stopped looking for them and looking for jobs. The official statistic for unemployment then doesn't count those people in the workforce. So if we use a modified unemployment rate that accounts for some of that, some people think the unemployment rate right now is around 8.3%. So again, better than it was in April, but a lot worse than it was pre-pandemic. The other, of course, issue happening is a public health crisis itself, the health and mortality effects of COVID. So we've already had in a cumulative 11 million US cases of COVID, a tragic 245,000 US deaths. And I'm sure as everyone's seen, the virus is still raging and surging throughout the country. Now, two other things have happened with this pandemic that have been very unusual and unprecedented, at least in terms of recent pandemics or recessions. So the first is stay-at-home orders. So last spring, since last spring, 40 or more states have issued mandatory or advisory stay-at-home orders. And these have been amended or pulled back and then reinstated across various states. So some of this is ongoing. But the point is there's this additional thing happening in the US these days, which is people are actually being told or advised to stay home. And the other key element, and this will come back when we talk about struggles for families, are school closures. So the US Census has been conducting a survey of US households to see how they're experiencing the pandemic. And last May, 100% of parents in this survey reported that their kids who were school age, K through 12 school age, had their classes canceled or were doing distance learning. So this is really quite remarkable, right? All of these kids all of a sudden are at home. So we'll come back to the stresses that puts on families. Now, currently there's variation across US states in terms of which states have gotten schools open or remain closed. My kids are still all home doing school, but so there's still ongoing struggles with school closures to various degrees. Okay, so let's go back to the spring when the first set of stay-at-home orders were announced. There was a bunch of sort of cute stories or speculating on social media that now that people couldn't go out and had nothing to do, they were going to stay home and make babies. Okay, so there was sort of a cutesy thing. This comes up all the time when there are blizzards or electricity blackouts, things that make people stay home. And this is a persistent myth. So at the bottom here, I'm showing you two old news stories. There's still these persistent myths of the blizzard babies, this whole cohort of babies born 9 months after the 1978 blizzard in the US. Similarly, people will talk about the babies born 9 months after a big blackout around, in earlier years. It turns out under close statistical scrutiny, there's really not a huge spike 9 months after these things, but still that idea captures the public imagination and people like to think that that might happen. So my colleague Phil and I were reading these and we were very skeptical and we said, I don't think so. And so in this slide, I introduced this idea and I refer to us as the dismal scientists. As some of you may know, economists have long been referred to as the dismal scientists because we make predictions that are, let's say, not so fun. And so our idea was, no, there's not going to be a baby boom. If anything, there's going to be a large baby bust. Okay, and so Phil and I have worked in the economics of fertility for many years, and I will explain what that means. I know not everyone realizes that economists study birth rates, but we knew enough to say people are going to respond to this by actually having fewer births, not more. Okay, and the key thing that drove us to that prediction was the job loss and economic uncertainty associated with this. So we predicted an 8 to 13% drop in births, which means we might see as many as 500,000 fewer births born that would have been conceived during this year on account of the pandemic. Okay, so that means that 500,000 fewer births than would have otherwise happened had the pandemic not hit. And we came to this conclusion in 3 ways. 1, thinking about economic reasoning and relevant evidence. 2, drawing empirical evidence specifically from what happened to births on account of the Great Recession. And 3, by looking back in recent history to see how birth rates responded to the Spanish flu in the early part of the 20th century. Okay, so for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to take you through those 3 pieces to say how we came to this conclusion. So first, I want to take a step back and talk about economics and birth rates. Okay. So economists model fertility in a decision-making framework, much like we model everything else. Okay, so this drives some non-economists crazy, but it actually winds up being very powerful, right? So how do we think about this? We think people maximize utility subject to budget constraints. They maximize their utility over stuff, things we like to buy, cars, clothes, foods, restaurant meals. Maximize utility over leisure time. We like leisure. Turns out people also like having kids. So that's something that gives us happiness, okay? But like everything else, it's subject to the costs of having kids, and those costs need to fall within what we can afford. So when I say it like that, it shouldn't sound so crazy, right? But others don't think about the decision to have a baby necessarily in this way. Okay, so often in these conversations, I come up against folks from the reproductive health community. They tend to focus on the mechanics of fertility, right? How babies are made. Now, certainly Phil and I are aware that babies are made in a certain way. Things have to happen. But our point is that people make decisions that make it more or less likely that you're going to have a baby. Okay. Other people, when I talk to, let's say, like journalists or non-scientists about the economics of fertility, they are inclined to focus on romance and say things like, do you really think people think about economics when they decide to have a baby? And my answer is yes. Is one of the largest economic decisions you will make in your lifetime. And so most people think about, can I afford to have a kid? Can I afford to have a kid now? Okay, so that's the way we approach this. You don't have to take my word for it that people generally tend to think about the economics of having a kid. We actually have a lot of empirical evidence suggesting that that's true. Okay, so I want to stipulate that it turns out it looks like kids are normal goods. Okay, so what do I mean by normal goods? If you remember from intermediate micro, that's a good that demand for that good goes up when people's income goes up. Okay, the fact that kids are normal goods surprised most people. And even a lot of economists who don't study the economics of fertility will tell you that kids are not normal goods. And where that misconception comes from is by looking across places or even over time. So what I'm showing you here is a graph of the relationship between the fertility rate and GDP per capita for countries. And what you see in this cross-sectional comparison is that it doesn't look like kids are normal goods. In countries where people are richer, people have fewer kids. And in poorer countries, people have more kids, okay? So from this cross-sectional relationship, people often draw the erroneous idea that kids are not normal goods. But what's happening across countries? A lot more than just the fact that people are richer. In rich countries, women are more likely to work, they're more likely to make more money, and so the cost of a woman's time, of a parent's time, is potentially higher. So people might have fewer kids for that reason. In poorer countries, children are less likely to be healthy. Babies are less likely to survive. So people have more babies for that reason. Okay, so these cross-sectional comparisons should not throw us for a loop. If we look at well-identified times when people had a shock, got more income or lost income, holding all these other environmental factors and prices constant, in those cases, we do see that, in fact, people respond by having more kids. So let me give you 3 quick examples of where economists have documented that a positive income shock has led to more kids. Okay, so in a paper a couple of years ago, my co-author and I showed that these in certain communities, an increase in jobs, an increase in economic activity, in those communities, you saw an increase in births. Very similarly, if you look back in the 1970s when there was a coal boom in similar communities, Appalachian communities, coal boom happened, these towns got more money, people had more kids. Okay, totally different context. Around 2006, the period from the early 2000s to 2008, there was a housing boom in the US. Homeowners saw a real increase in their housing wealth. And what did we see? We saw that homeowners had more kids. And really interestingly, during that same period, renters had fewer. Now that's very consistent with an increase in wealth leading to more kids. And for renters, all they experienced was an increase in housing costs, okay? And housing costs are a large cost associated with having kids. Those folks didn't get any offsetting increase in wealth, and so they responded only to the price shock and had fewer kids. There's also evidence that things work in the reverse direction. When people lose money, when income drops, people have fewer kids. So in a series of influential papers by David Otter and his co-authors, they look at what happens from the import competition from China that happened post-2000. And when the US started importing a lot more goods from China, basically a set of communities in the US that used to have a lot of their economic activity tied up in making those goods, they saw their jobs erode and income eroded. And one of the consequences of that was that there was lower birth rates in those communities. Okay. A separate study by a different author looks at what happens when plants close and husbands lose their jobs. And he follows people over time in the data, and he sees that if the husband of a couple loses their job because a plant closed, so through no fault of that person, that couple subsequently has fewer kids over their lifetime as compared to a very similar couple who didn't experience a plant closing. Okay, so all this suggests when people get more income, they have more kids. When people lose income, they have fewer. A related fact from the economics of fertility literature is that births are cyclical. So this is a little bit different. This means that people time their births such that in the aggregate we see when the economy is booming, that's when people decide they can afford more kids and have more kids. And when the economy is contracting and unemployment is higher, we see fewer people have kids, okay? So Phil and I look back at the Great Recession, right, which was a really big downturn in the economy, to ask what happened to births in that Great Recession between 2007 and 2009. Before the Great Recession, the birth rate was 69.1 per thousand women. After, it was 63.0 births per thousand women. So a roughly 9% decline, which translates into about 400,000 fewer births a year. Okay, so that's sort of like prima facie evidence that this might lead to a reduction in births. But economists should be, right, aware, like worried about just looking at things over time. The same way I say we didn't just want to look across places to see if kids were normal goods. Over time, maybe other things were changing nationally too. So what we do is we look within states and we ask whether states that experienced the Great Recession to a greater degree subsequently experienced a greater reduction in births. So what I'm plotting here along the x-axis is the percentage point change in the unemployment rate at a state level. The y-axis is the percentage change in the birth rate, again, at the state level. And what you can see is that there's this very clear linear relationship such that the states that experienced a larger increase in unemployment associated with the Great Recession also experienced a larger reduction in births, okay? When we run a regression for a longer period of time, controlled for a bunch of things, we get a relationship suggesting that a 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate leads to a 1% drop in births. So that relationship is going to be really crucial to what we use to make our prediction about what's going to happen associated with the COVID pandemic. Okay, now let me step away from the economic situation and think about what should we expect just from the fact that there's a public health crisis. And so to do this, we look back at the Spanish flu. So this was the 2018 flu pandemic that hit a third of the world's population and led to many deaths in the US. So the exact number is disputed, but one common number is about 675,000 US deaths. So this was a really large pandemic that hit the world and the US, okay? One particularly bad thing about the Spanish flu was that it had higher than usual flu mortality rate for young adults. This makes it different from the current pandemic. Okay, but another interesting thing about the Spanish flu is there was not an associated recession. The war effort kept economic activity really high in the US at the time. So in some sense, looking back at the Spanish flu allows us to isolate just what happens in a public health crisis. Okay, so we looked back at data. We got data on deaths and births during this time period. So the red line here plots deaths on account of influenza influenza and pneumonia. Okay, so the two largest causes of death from the Spanish flu. And you see there's a spike here in 2018 and a second spike here in 2020 in the US. The blue line plots births dated back by 9 months. So you could think of them as conceptions, okay? This is conceptions in the US. And what's really quite remarkable is that there are two large busts in births conceived at the same time as the Spanish flu spiked, okay, in the US, okay? And it's worth pausing on this because in 1918 and 1920, people did not have access to modern contraception like they do now. And again, there was no recession. So this was just really people responding to the public health crisis, okay? Another interesting thing to note is there's not an offsetting spike after. So it's not like all of these births came back after, right? So those births just never happened. Okay, so this is a 12% decline in births. Now, like I said, the Spanish flu really hit people of childbearing age in a way that the current COVID pandemic is not. So that's an implication that we probably won't experience this time, Okay, so we don't expect an additional 12% in decrease in births on account of just the public health crisis, but the lesson from the Spanish flu makes us think that there's going to be a larger decrease in births than there would be if the only thing happening was a huge economic hit. Okay, so even with limited contraception, the public health crisis back then led to this large drop in births. So we're going to say, let's say there's an additional 3% decline. Okay, so how do we get to our 300 to 500,000 number? The unemployment rate increased from 7 to 10, a 7 to 10 percentage point increase in unemployment over the past year, right? And so using the estimated relationship we found looking at the Great Recession, that leads us to predict a 7 to 10% drop in. That alone would lead to something like 270 to 380,000 fewer births, okay? If we assume an additional 3% decline on account of the public health crisis beyond the economic crisis, then our estimate leads, it increases to 300 to 500,000 fewer births, okay? So that's all we could draw conclusions from. But we might think that the bust is even larger than that even our really large number might be too conservative because we haven't additionally considered the fact that social distancing rules means that some people who would have gone out during this period and met and either started coupling up or had a cohabitating relationship or an unplanned pregnancy, some of those won't happen. And I'll go so far as to say, school closures, parents are home with kids. So based on my own life, I'm going to predict that people are going to have fewer higher order kids. So that might mean that people who would have had a second or third or fourth during this time period are not going to. But we don't have any basis from which to predict what happens to births on account of these measures, since these are unprecedented. Two other things I want to point out. The longer the pandemic lasts and the deeper this is, the more persistent and permanent the reduction in births will be. Meaning, if people are out of work for a full year or 2 years, we know from existing economic evidence that their earnings never fully recover. And so that means this isn't just going to be a shift of people who don't have births now and have them in 2 or 3 years. This is going to mean a permanent reduction in births, okay? How much that happens is going to depend on how quickly we get ourselves out of the economic situation we're in. Okay, this slide just shows you that survey evidence supports our notion, not necessarily our numbers, but our notion that people are not inclined to have babies when they're living through a crisis like this. And so what I'm showing here is a survey that the Guttmacher Institute did of US young women, and it shows that 20% say that they want to have kids later than they planned, or they want to have fewer children. And similarly, last spring, there was a survey done of young adults in 5 European countries, and the same thing. We see large numbers of people who intended to have a baby this year say they were going to postpone or abandon those plans. Okay, so survey evidence supports this idea. Okay, what are the implications of a baby bust? Okay, so demographics have large implications for economics. So first, I'll acknowledge at an individual or personal level, this means a lot of couples or families aren't going to have the number of kids they would have liked to have. Okay, so there's an individual loss there from not having kids or kids not having siblings. A more immediate thing is there's going to be a decreased cohort. So fewer kids in this cohort, which means fewer kids get to school in 5 years or get to college in 18 years. Some people think that's a good thing. There'll be fewer, less competition for resources or spots in college. Okay. But like I said, if this is permanent, and if this is multi-year, then we really worry about having a smaller workforce. And this is where things get really worrisome for countries. Having a smaller workforce is bad for productivity, and it's bad for social insurance. So remember, our current workers support our retirees, our Social Security recipients, our disability insurance recipients. As the population ages and fewer young people are born, that puts a lot of strain on nations' social insurance programs. And so it's widely recognized that declining and low birth rates are a challenge for countries. What do countries do when they're faced with perennially declining or low birth rates? There's really only two things they could do. They pursue pro-natalist policies like tax credits for kids, or they're more open to immigration. Okay. I just want to point out that in this context of, an aging population, this COVID baby bust that I expect comes at a time when fertility rates in the US have already been trending down. So there's a number of fertility rates, but all of them are showing that they're really at a modern historical low. Okay, so that's why people are really concerned about this. Okay, so that's the COVID baby bust part of this. I just want to use the next 10 minutes to mention additional stressors that I view the COVID pandemic as imposing on families and children. All right, so let's focus for a minute on school and daycare closures, which my personal view is that policymakers did not focus on nearly enough back in the spring. This is something that we really should have realized was going to pose an issue, not just for children who are missing out on learning, but for our workforce, okay? So 23% of workers, that's about 38 million workers, have at least one kid under the age of 13. So even if you weren't worried about the kids themselves, policymakers should have realized, hey, if we don't do what it takes to make sure schools can open safely, there's a lot of workers who aren't going to be able to go back to work. If I look at essential workers, so people whose jobs meant that they could keep going and had to keep going, we still have about a quarter of full-time workers and slightly more among workers in low-income families, okay? Now, among workers with young children, we also need to make sure we don't have this misconception that, oh, well, a lot of them have a stay-at-home spouse who could take care of the kid, okay? 69% of workers with young children have a working spouse. 15% have no spouse present at all. So it's only 16% of working parents have a non-working spouse in the household, okay? So daycare and school closures put a real strain on working parents and on the workforce more broadly. Okay. The next thing I want to point out is that if we really think about the workers who are under strain during this crisis, again, acknowledging that people who are out of work are under tremendous strain, I'm just pointing out that even people who keep their job are under strain, okay? If I look in the data at essential workers who are unable to work from home, given the nature of their occupation and industry, the data show us that they're disproportionately low wage, non-college educated, and non-white. So this is yet another way that these disadvantaged groups are getting hammered in the current pandemic, okay? So we know that these disadvantaged groups are already experiencing elevated rates of health issues on account of the crisis. We already know that they're experiencing elevated rates of job loss and unemployment. But even those who keep their jobs, okay, are more likely to have to go to work and potentially deal with the stress that comes from school and childcare closures. Okay. Another point I want to make is about the gendered labor market effects of the pandemic recession. Okay, so I already showed you that there's a lot of working parents out there who are going to be under strain. There's a lot of working parents who are low wage and non-white who are going to be under strain. Mothers are going to be hit worse than fathers. Even if we have more balance in home life and childcare responsibilities as compared to previous generations, it's still the case that mothers spend more time taking care of their kids than fathers. So 21% of children in this country live with just a mom, that should say lone mother. Okay. And even in married households, mothers contribute twice as many hours to taking care of the children as fathers. We see this in census time use data. Okay. And in fact, in the census survey data, the pulse survey that they're doing of households to ask about pandemic conditions, what we see is the share of parents who are out of work specifically because of childcare issues, first, for everybody is sizable. And second, it's more than twice as large for mothers as compared to fathers. So even 12 months into the pandemic, when you might have thought that people were able to make adjustments, more than 30% of mothers report not working because of childcare issues, and 12% of fathers. Okay, so again, these are going to have lasting implications. When women are pulled out of the workforce, it's very hard to re-enter and to get back on your earnings trajectory. Okay, what I'm showing here is another way of looking at the gendered labor market effects. So one interesting thing to note is that in most recessions, men tend to experience higher increases in unemployment than women. And that's what these blue lines show. In previous recessions, the difference between female and male unemployment rates. And that's just a feature of the type of jobs that tend to get lost during recessions. In this recession, women are experiencing an elevated rate of unemployment. Okay, and that comes from two features. One, the industries that have been particularly hard hit are the industries that disproportionately employ women, like hospitality and leisure industries. And I already mentioned childcare responsibilities. Okay, so that just goes to emphasize the gendered labor market effects. The last factual point I want to make about the stress of this pandemic on kids in particular is the elevated rate of food and housing insecurity that low-income families with children are suffering on account of this associated recession. Okay, so food insecurity has doubled overall and tripled among households with children. Okay, and it's also the case that housing insecurity has heightened, especially among families with children. Okay, so there's really just a terrible amount of need out there, especially among low-income families with children. All right, so my two final thoughts. This moves away a little bit from the specifics of the COVID pandemic, but to my mind, as someone who has sort of studied the economics of families and child well-being, this COVID pandemic and our nation's response to it has yet again revealed to me how our country fails to prioritize the well-being of children, low-income children in particular, over and over again. And the fact that policymakers did not anticipate how hard school closures would be for families with children and economically disadvantaged children in particular, I think really goes to highlight the fact that children are just not a policy priority. And so it finally led me to write an essay that I've sort of been wanting to write for a while, which is, if we prioritize children and taking care of children the way we prioritize taking care of the elderly in this country, we could, for not that much money, eradicate child poverty. Okay, so I just run this simple thought experiment, and this is posted in a Brookings essay. If we gave the average Social Security benefit to every child in this country in poverty, we would eliminate child poverty for $180 billion, which might sound like a lot, but really isn't compared to all the other things we spend our money on. So the way we're failing to take care of kids during this crisis, I think, should be a wake-up call that we need to do more to take care of kids more generally. And my final thought, which you could see in my points at the end, talking about just how hard hit many families are, even those who manage to keep their jobs. There's still a great amount of economic need out there, and a second round of pandemic fiscal relief from Congress, in my view, is needed immediately. And that I just bring up because it's in the news right now, and political wrangling between the two parties is keeping it from happening. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kearney. I know that people can't clap, so you can't hear them clapping, but I know that they would be clapping now. So it sounds peculiar if I just clap by myself, so I won't do that. We already have a couple of great questions, but I want to remind people they can type in their questions. As I'm moderating this, I'm going to take moderator privilege, and I'm going to ask you the first question. One thing that kind of interested me is, do you know what's happening to marriage rates during the pandemic? There's two reasons that I ask this. One is I would imagine that people will be postponing weddings because of the inability to get large groups together. But the second was I did read a story today in the Laredo local newspaper that said Webb County currently is not, you can't get a marriage certificate yet until 2021 now because all their appointments are full. But I wondered whether that would have any feed-on effect into fertility rates in the longer term.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'll start with your last point, which is that, marriage rates have implications for fertility rates. So it is the case that 60% of births are to married couples. And so you're exactly right that marriage rates have implications for fertility rates. This is something I thought of, but I don't have good empirical estimate to predict about what is going to happen to marriage and divorce. What I can tell you is that, like fertility, both marriage and divorce are pro-cyclical. Okay, so people get married when they feel like they have more money because, again, people think about, not just the cost of a wedding, but often getting married in many people's minds is when we set up our own home, we potentially buy our house, these things that are expensive. So just based on the economics alone, I would predict that some people are going to delay marriage, right? We also have evidence on the importance of what's called marriageable men. Okay, so the more employable men are, the more economically secure they are, we see marriage rates increase. So again, to the extent that people, men in particular, are losing their jobs and those losses are permanent, then we might expect a somewhat persistent decrease in marriage, not just a postponement. But I want to mention divorce too, because again, there's been stories in the news, people are expecting an increase in divorce because people are under stress, living at home together, no one's going to work, everyone's in the house. But offsetting that is divorce is expensive, not just the process of divorce, but splitting a household and paying for two households. And so I don't know what to predict with regard to divorce either, because it might be true that there's an increase in strain on couples, but at the same time, there's a financial strain that's going to keep them from trying to set up two households at this time. So I will eagerly look at the data in 6 months, but I don't have a very clear prediction right now.
Excellent, thank you. So our first question is from Nathan Smith, and he wants to know, have you looked at rates of miscarriages during stressful times? Does this change during recessions and other times like that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So it is true that when people are under stress, it is both, biologically harder to conceive, and it's more likely to miscarry. So I should have mentioned this explicitly. That's part of what we think is the effect of the pandemic health situation, separate from the recession. So presumably that's part of what happened during the Spanish flu. That's part of the reason why we think there's going to be more than just this decision to postpone or abandon childbearing because of these biological or physiological effects. It's very hard to quantify those effects in the data because they're not very well recorded. And people have multiple reasons for not taking a pregnancy to term. And so usually what we wind up doing when we look in the data is saying, births and pregnancies, those are pretty well measured. And then whether, a pregnancy is unintentionally or intentionally not taken to term, it's really hard to decipher between the two. But I will note that sort of more, again, I said reproductive health folks who think of this as the mechanics, they've also been predicting a reduction in fertility, and their idea is that there's going to be an increase in miscarriages. So any of that is on top of our economic predictions, but we try to incorporate that by upping our estimate to account for the public health element of this.
Thank you. I should say, I know you're not looking at the Q&A sessions because I'm trying to read it, but there's lots of people thanking you and saying how much they enjoyed your presentation.
Oh, good. Thank you.
The next question is from Gilberto Celadon. He asks, from an economist standpoint, do you think it's better for the welfare of the United States to close down non-essential activities? And he also asked about suicide during recessions and things like the COVID COVID panic. What do you see happening there?
Yeah, so I'll start with the first about closing down essential businesses. So one thing that's been interesting to look at in the data is that a lot of the reduction in business activity and consumer activity seems to track COVID numbers in a place, regardless of what the government is stipulating. So even if local policymakers don't say, essential, you can't go out and do non-essential activity, people are responding because of the health risk. And vice versa, people aren't always following any government mandates. So I don't have a very firm view on whether the government needs to mandate it or not, as opposed to what the public health response needs to be. And people either need to believe it, right, and take ownership of that and act responsibly, regardless of what government stipulates. The second on suicides, etc., we know that during recessions, depression and suicide and all those terrible things increase. And certainly that's what the numbers are suggesting now. Numbers that I saw, I'm not an expert on this, but I recently saw some numbers that showed, in particular for young adults and 20-somethings, the metrics on mental health are really quite worrying. That seems to be a group that's really experiencing an increase in depression and anxiety and suicidal thoughts around this pandemic, which is yet another reason why it's imperative that we do what's necessary to get this pandemic under control. But I will say those kinds of issues are also what gives me pause in sort of thinking that there's like an easy out where the government says everyone has to stay home, because I do think for some people that's really crushing to their mental health, and that's something that needs to be in the balance and in the trade-off calculation that we make.
Thank you. Our next question is from Brent Johnson, and he wants to know, do you have a breakdown of regarding the baby boom, baby bust? Do you have numbers that break down by demographics? What do you think the demographic breakdown is going to be of these changes?
That's a really good question. We did not attempt to do that. If I'm pushed to guess, I'm going to expect that the largest reductions in births are going to come from the people who have been hardest hit by this pandemic, and that is going to be low-income, non-college educated households.
Excellent. The next kind of question is more policy-related question from Arthur Soto Vasquez. He says, what kind of fiscal relief would you like to see legislated to encourage people to have more children?
So the first is I want to have fiscal relief to this crisis to help people get through the winter, which is why I don't want Congress to wait until February. And on that score alone, I think immediately we need to extend federal enhanced unemployment insurance benefits to people who are out of work. I would also have like a pandemic wage subsidy. We could do this through the earned income tax credit for low income workers who kept their jobs, but for all the reasons I said, have been under tremendous strain. I also think we need to be shoring up our very limited programs for housing security and food security, again, during this crisis. And I think the federal government needs to be giving grant money to state and local governments. They're experiencing large reductions in their revenues at the same time as their spending needs have increased. And that's the way to get more money to schools to open safely. So all of that, I think, needs to happen now as part of a fiscal relief package, separate from the issue of doing so to increase births. Once we're through this crisis, if we want to focus on sort of pro-natalist policies to increase birth rates, where I would put my energy, my policy energy, is towards things that essentially make it easier for families to combine work and having kids. So we have recently expanded the child tax credit, which is a good thing. It allows families up to certain income levels to keep more money. We also need to do more in terms of subsidizing or providing childcare in this country, in particular for low-income families. But those kinds of things that make it easier for families to have kids and have economic security, that's probably our best way of boosting fertility. And again, that's not the only good thing that would come out of such policies.
Thank you. Our next question is from Amanda Rangel, and she wants to know, do you have any information on child abuse rates during the pandemic? And I guess also spousal abuse rates might change.
Yeah, so I don't have numbers on that. It is certainly, I think, one of the most worrying things that is surely happening. And like many of you, I've read news stories about actually rates of reported abuse are down, but that's because kids aren't in school where most of this abuse gets noticed. And so while reported rates of abuse are down, at least anecdotally, what some are reporting is that kids are showing up in emergency rooms with more serious consequences of abuse, right? Which has led many people to worry that there's more abuse going on at home unnoticed, because all the people who generally have eyes on kids and report these things and notice these things before the kid winds up in the emergency room, those safety valves are not opening right now. So I think, again, that's one of the horrible things that's happening and makes it imperative for us to make sure schools are open and families are under less strain. But it's really hard to know exactly what's happening, in particular because the reporting is lower than it would be in normal times.
Thank you. The next question is from Juan Reyes, and he wants to know about social welfare versus personal finance skills. Could improving personal finance skills help in this kind of situation?
Yeah, so this is a challenging one. The issue of financial literacy and finance skills is one that people who work, with economically struggling families work on a lot. What we know is that households have large income fluctuations, and many households, sort of do things to get by. And if they experience a short-term income loss, they delay some payments, and that's how they demonstrate sort of financial resilience. My reading of the evidence on financial literacy training, etc., is that the impacts are, again, to my mind, not all that encouraging. And so, I'm more inclined towards the view that we have to help people stabilize their income. And, people who, even if they're living as responsibly as they can, if they lose their job and miss out on 2 months of paychecks, it's really hard for them to afford their rent. Very few low-income families can bank that much. And so while being sort of financially savvy is clearly important, I don't think we could have relied on personal responsibility and precautionary savings to help many families get through a pandemic that's this deep and this long.
Thank you. The next question was from Lords Boardman, and she wants to know, how many years do you think it will take until everything is stable economically speaking, and I guess until it starts, assuming things turn around fairly quickly, I guess, with the vaccines, and how long it'll take to start affecting fertility positively?
Yeah, I mean, I'm wary of making predictions of this kind because it really does depend on the path of the virus, right? So the fact that the virus is resurging now suggests we're going to have a long winter, and business activity is going to soften, right? We already have seen in a lot of places in the past couple of weeks, things like restaurant capacity drop from 75 to 25%. And so I think there's going to be a lot of stop, and closures and in the small business space. And so the longer that that goes on and the longer that it takes us to get the virus itself under control, the recovery could be very, very long and very slow. The news about the vaccines is really encouraging. If we are able as a country to scale up the production of the vaccine, the distribution of the vaccine, given the apparent efficacy of the vaccine, we could be looking at the pandemic being under control by summer. We could hasten a recovery the more that Congress commits to well-targeted stimulus spending, right? The more help it gives to small businesses and households to get back on their feet, the recovery will be faster. The slower it takes, the longer it takes for the virus to get under control and for businesses to reopen, then the longer families are going to suffer the consequences, and all sorts of the tragic things we've been talking about, including but not limited to depressed birth rates, will persist.
Thank you. A couple of people have had comments on the cyclicality and the recent peak, which I think fit into that last question too. The next question is, you talked about how declining fertility is going to affect Social Security in the future. What about immigration? I mean, obviously, how's that going to be affected by the pandemic, and how is that going to have an impact on the sustainability of these programs in the future?
Yeah, this is a really important point, which is if our population continues to age, right? Like 15% of our population is already above the age of 65, and that's a feature of two things. One, people are living longer, and two, people are having fewer babies, right? So the older our country gets, the only thing we could do to shore up our workforce is either to increase birth rates or allow in more immigration. And so that becomes a political question as to how open the country is going to be towards immigration. But that's exactly the kind of thing that countries that have faced really severe demographic pressures and pressures on their social insurance systems, that's what they've had to do, is allow greater levels of immigration into the country.
No, that's an excellent point. And I'm sure immigration has also been affected during the pandemic because of the because it's harder to cross borders at the moment with countries so closed up. The next question we have is on universal basic income. This is from Liliana Ibarra. Do you think that would be beneficial post-COVID? And she thanks you for the great points you brought up.
Oh, thanks. So I actually, I'm an opponent of the idea of universal basic income, and I've actually written about this over the past years and put out some essays and op-eds on this. I do not favor universal basic income for a few reasons. One, universal basic income by definition is not targeted on people in need. Okay, so if we actually had a government program of giving every adult 18 and over in this country $10,000 a year, that would literally cost 3/4 of our spending. Okay, so the only way to do that is to basically get rid of all of our other safety net programs, including DI and SS and Social Security, which of course is a terrible idea. Even if you limit it and means test it and sort of phase out the $10,000, you can have the cost of it, but it's still not very well targeted. So we have these other safety net programs that, are complicated, and that's, to some, that's like a limitation of them. Oh, you have to be, a working parent with young kids, or you have to have this demonstrated need, like a documented disability. But the reason we do that is to make sure we're targeting scarce resources on people who really need it. And so I am much more in favor of targeting our assistance and our income support programs to people who are in need, rather than giving less to everybody. And we also know, in terms of social return, like money spent on low-income kids has a great social return, because those kids are healthier, they do better in school, they grow up to be more productive workers. And so I'm all for targeting resources. My opposition to UBI does not extend to having increased amounts of cash income or even guaranteed income to keep people out of poverty, like the way I discussed having something like a social insurance program for kids who, through no fault of their own, live in poverty as kids. But again, that moves away from universal and really targets income support to people who need it.
Excellent. The next question was on a more general question on the COVID pandemic. Which industries do you think will suffer or change the most in the long run with this pandemic, and what other big changes do you see coming because of the pandemic?
So first, I'll start with the one that's closest to the COVID baby bust, I predict. There's just an article in the Wall Street Journal this week that cites our study and uses it as a hook to talk to companies that make diapers and baby formula, and they are expecting to see their production go down, right? So that's a very closely tied industry that I think most people wouldn't have thought of, but is likely going to have depressed profits in the coming years. But at a broader level, I think it's going to take a while for travel to return to the levels that we all traveled before the pandemic hit. In part, it will take a while for people to be comfortable again, getting on airplanes, traveling across borders, taking cruise ships, etc. But some of the travel won't come back because people have realized now how much they could do things like this on Zoom, right? So I expect a lot of business travel will now be conducted virtually, not all of it by any means, but now we have an infrastructure in place where some of that travel has become unnecessary. So I expect the travel and hospitality industries to sort of have the longest recovery and perhaps never quite recover to the same level. Again, like thinking of things like the restaurant industry, it's going to depend on how quickly the vaccine is distributed, how many people take it, if the virus mutates and comes back in a different form. So that all really depends. And then as economists, we always think about habit formation. And so how many of the new habits that people have adopted that have changed their way of interacting and going out, how much of that persists, will dictate just some changes. And there will be what economists refer to as sectoral reallocation, right? Some jobs won't come back. People might forever now do more takeout or cooking at home. And so that will just shift, right? We might see more food delivery type services as opposed to dine-in restaurant. In steady state, that might not be so bad if the aggregate level of economic activity returns, but there will be a shifting across sectors.
The next question is from Lisbeth Salazar, and she wants to know, what do you think is going to happen to education rates, but due to things such as students dropping out and failing classes due to the stress of at-home schooling?
Yeah, I am super worried about what is going to happen to the kids right now, in particular, who are in kindergarten through second grade. So those are the grades where kids really learn to read, and they are going to experience deficits that are going to be quite persistent. And this is going to be especially true for kids from lower income, economically disadvantaged homes, where the parents are just not able to help them at home keep up with the learning loss. So, for example, we know that over the summer, there's always learning loss after kids take 3 months off, right? They come back at a lower level, especially young kids in reading and math than where they were in May or June. For some kids, they're essentially right now having an 18-month learning loss. I mean, the implications of that are really, really bad. And some of those kids are never going to make it up, and they're going to be at a deficit throughout their K through 12 experience, which puts them on a sort of lower track permanently. That is where I really worry, and I get really upset that we didn't do more to make sure that that didn't happen. At the higher end, higher education levels, enrollment rates this fall are down, in particular among community colleges, where low income and minority students are overrepresented. And so I'm also really worried about that. What I'm worried about is people who took a semester or a year off, maybe for good reason, right? Because the value proposition changed. They didn't want to do online school. Maybe because they had, individuals in their household that were high risk and they couldn't afford going out and exposing their family to potential virus risk. All of that might have made sense, but what I worry about is the students for whom their educational plans will be derailed. So it winds up not being just, I took a semester off or I took a year off, but I wound up never going to college to get the degree. That too will lead to really persistent lifetime earnings losses, and is something I think we really need to make sure doesn't happen, which is why I also think what the federal government needs to be doing is giving more money to states to channel to their public and community colleges to help serve students and make sure that educational plans are not derailed on account of this pandemic.
Excellent. There's a couple of questions related to abortion about what's happened to abortion during the during the thing. How do you account for it in your study, and what's the relationship in the long term between birth rates and abortions?
So, in general, falling birth rates in the U.S. have been driven by declining pregnancy rates. So abortions are also not just in this period, but over time declining. So the main way that women have reduced their fertility in this country is by reducing their rates of pregnancy. In the pandemic, what has happened? I don't know. Remember, my estimates are based on a prediction based on what we saw in previous episodes. And so when I look at, for example, the Great Recession, and I say that a 1 percentage point increase in unemployment led to a 1% reduction in births, I don't mechanically try to disentangle how much of that came from a reduction in pregnancy versus a reduction in the share of pregnancies that were carried to completion. And I'm using my language precisely there because in the data, we really don't know whether someone had a miscarriage or abortion. We know that abortions are underrepresented in the data. A lot of women seem to report them as miscarriages. So what I know is if there was a non-completed pregnancy, I don't disentangle that for the sake of predicting the baby bust. It doesn't, as a practical matter which margin is driving that. But it's too early for us to see in the data, what's actually happening right now. We don't have the birth or pregnancy data from March yet, so I can't say.
Excellent. Now there's a couple of questions related to children, and one is related to your suicide and mental health discussion earlier for the broad population. How has this changed for children over this period? And that's from Misty Corbett. And another related question is, do you think there's going to be an increase in social anxiety among children as a majority of the child development is happening at home? And that's from Isabella Correa.
So I have to say, as a social scientist, I don't know. I haven't seen the data on this. On an anecdotal level, I will tell you that my sister is a clinical psychologist, and she is, every time I talk to her, she's like, I can't even tell you how many kids she was seeing before who had anxiety. Their anxiety is through the roof, and she is getting calls. Basically, her phone's ringing off the hook from parents whose kids now have social anxiety. And so when you get the two of us in the room, both as an economist and a child psychologist, we're sort of losing our minds that it wasn't a priority that kids got back to school. Because again, anecdotally, she's seeing a huge increase. And I think that's a common thing people hear from child psychologists, but I have not seen sort of aggregate data on that.
Thank you. Now, you've talked about a number of policies that could raise fertility. If these were enacted, what's your timeline for starting to see the effects? This is from Mario and Pena.
That's a good question. So I want to be clear that none of these are sort of like silver bullets, and the effects that generally are found in studies that look at what happened, that look at what happens when government policy and tax policy and benefit policy shifts a lot, they're pretty small. And so more broadly, sort of, we should have in mind that a robust, vibrant economic situation will do a lot more than sort of these targeted policy refinements. Generally, their effects are just sort of small.
My next question is the good news. Do you have any good news that came out of COVID? And other people ask which industries will do well because of COVID, other than the vaccine making industry, I guess.
And Zoom stock is through the roof, of course. I hate to be a pessimist, and as a personal level, I've been looking for silver linings all throughout the pandemic. What do I think? And now this is me speaking, more as just someone who's lived through it, like any of you could do, as opposed to economists. For people who aren't struggling on a daily basis to provide housing or food for their family, who aren't crushed under the weight of real mental health challenges, maybe for some there's been a positive effect of life slowing down a little bit, not having to commute all the time, spending more time with your family and loved ones. So maybe for a lot of people, there has been that silver lining, and some of that will persist, and we will have a perhaps more slower paced, joyful lifestyle going forward. But that's sort of me, just some personal wishful thinking. In the aggregate, when I look at the implications for society, in particular through the lens of economics, it's hard to find bright spots.
The next question, and this is coming in several forms from several people. So I'm trying to pool questions now. So I apologize if it doesn't sound quite like your question. But a couple of people have asked about how you think the government transition that's going on now might affect the recovery and might affect the progression with the pandemic.
One thing that I find discouraging is, even with the election over, Congress does not seem poised to quickly pass a second round of relief or stimulus. And I would have thought with the election over, the Democrats and Republicans in Congress would come together to do that. I'm holding out some hope that there will be enough pressure on Congress to do that. But the tea leaves this week are not encouraging on that front. In terms of the administration changes, this is not particularly insightful. I think anyone would say the same. It seems we have an administration coming in that is more open to the science on the virus and taking it seriously. So, in my mind, that's a good thing if the administration is going to be far more bullish on spending money on testing, on vaccine distribution, on really prioritizing it. The flip side, I know there are people who worry that the new administration will be more draconian in terms of trying to shut down economic activity. But as I said, it seems that the real reduction in economic activity comes not from government mandates, but from consumers not going out and spending money when the virus is raging in their communities. So there really seems to be less of a tension between getting the public health pandemic under control and stimulating the economy than I think is sometimes, they're pitted against each other in a way that I think has been counterproductive in a political policy sense.
Excellent. Rita Espangbedo, she wanted to ask more about your Social Security program for children and how it worked. What would it look like?
Yeah, so I have not yet, though maybe I will, flesh it out in terms of like a very detailed way that somebody in Congress could actually propose. All I did in this simple exercise would say, look, Social Security was enacted to reduce elderly poverty in this country, and it worked. Elderly poverty came way down when Social Security was introduced, such that people over 65 now have the lowest rates of poverty in the country. So what if we had extended that same priority to kids And all I said was, if every kid in the country who lived in poverty, right, using the official definition of poverty, which means for a family of four, less than $24,000, give or take, what if every kid living in poverty got the average Social Security benefit, which is about $15,000 a year? Okay, we would drive child poverty rates to below 1%. Okay, so that's sort of astounding. Now, a critic or a skeptic might say, well, you're not really giving money to kids, you're giving money to parents, and these parents aren't going to spend it wisely. Okay, so maybe for some parents that's not true, but you really have to think, for you to have that reaction and allow that to lead you to just let child poverty persist in this country, you really have to think that poor parents don't act responsibly for their kids en masse. Like I said, maybe there's some, but what we know from the limited social programs we have that do give income to low-income families, what we see in the data is that kids do better, which means that, again, in general, on net, on average, when you give money to poor parents, they spend it in ways that makes their kids healthier, do better in school, and ultimately do better when they're adults. So, you know, if we really worried about parents not spending the money wisely, you could design the policy in a way such that, let's say, every child who receives this check has to have a well-being checkup with a doctor each year. Make sure the kids are not malnourished or something like that, right? You could put in those kinds of stipulations to make sure the money is being spent, you know, in a way that without the kids looking like they're malnourished or abused. The other thing we'd have to do if I fleshed out this program seriously to be a policy someone could propose is you never want to have a policy with a cliff, meaning as soon as a family of four makes $1 more than the poverty line, they lose the benefit. You never have a policy like that, right? You'd have to phase it out so that families, let's say up to 2 times the poverty line, still get some amount of benefits and it just phases out. It actually wouldn't be that hard. We send checks to, like I said, we send checks to retirees. We send supplemental security income payments to Social Security recipients for whom their Social Security benefit isn't enough to keep them out of poverty. We just don't do it for kids.
A couple of questions have come up about economic benefits emerging through innovation due to the pandemic. Do you see, or disruptive innovation, do you see any of this happening in the future?
Okay, so that's a good question, and maybe that's where I should have gone when you asked me if there's anything positive. I think it's a little too early to tell, but you know, as I alluded to, now that so many companies, schools, etc., have set up the architecture for people to be able to work from home, for national meetings to be conducted, that's activity enhancing. Right. And like I said, I expect a lot of that to stick. So that will be good. One thing I am perhaps somewhat hopeful about is that there will be positive disruption in the higher education industry. I think a lot is lost when classes are delivered in this format. I really miss being in the classroom with my students. I really miss having one-on-one meetings with my students in my office as opposed to on Zoom. So I do not think that online education is a wholesale substitute. But I do think that some, large classes, et cetera, could now be delivered more readily in this format, such that, some degrees could be shortened in length and in cost. And that can make higher education, again, if some of that happens around the edges, it could make higher education more accessible and affordable. Work for more students, be more flexible. So I do think, or I hope, that maybe some of that innovation sticks in ways that are productive in the higher education sector.
Excellent. I should say that despite this being online, we're very thankful that you talked to us today, even though you can't be here in person. So although we know you would have given a great presentation in person too.
Yes, and I can't see anybody's faces when they ask the questions.
and you can't see how many people are listening to you either.
That's right.
The next question for Angelita Nunez is, what do you think the long-term effect on women will be? Do you think they'll leave their jobs next year due to limited childcare?
So here's one thing we know from previous studies. When people lose their jobs for any reason, men and women, it takes them a long time to recover their earnings trajectory. Okay, so very rarely do we see a job loss followed by an immediate resumption of sort of work at the previous level of earnings. So I really worry that this shock to women's labor force participation and their work will not recover immediately. Okay, so I'll grant maybe for some women they decide, actually, I really liked being home all the time with my kids. For many of them, I think even when they get back to the workforce, time out of the workforce usually has a dynamic effect. And so, some estimates are that, this will lead to sort of sizable permanent earnings losses, in particular for women, because like I said, they seem to be suffering more in this recession. I don't think that's immediately going to correct itself. And I want to say, I'm not subscribing to the view that someone's to blame for that, right? Like, there are some who will say, well, that's because we don't do enough to support women, or women are still burdened in the household. Maybe, but I just think this is another terrible consequence of this pandemic that put families in a really hard position. And we know economic downturns really hurt workers in a persistent way.
I want to once again apologize to you if I haven't got to your questions and you're listening to. We've got a lot of great questions here, and I'm trying to get as many as I can. So I apologize to. Thank you very much for your great questions. But my next one is from Kathleen Gorka. She says retirees paid into this Social Security system while they were working. Do you see for your proposal there being some kind of repayment as by children who get these payments as adults?
Yeah, I should have anticipated that question, and I'm sorry I didn't. So that is something that I think lends a lot of political support to Social Security, is this notion that people have paid into the system. Okay, to be clear though, it's true that people have to contribute Social Security. Social Security is a redistributive program, so you get a lot more out of it if you're lower income than you do if you're higher income. And your benefits are really a formula of your, it's redistributive. So it's not just a savings program. It's not that people get out of it what they put into it the way they would a private savings account. So a lot of what the formula for Social Security is doing is moving money from people who are better off to people who are worse off. And in that sense, it's a social insurance program with redistribution built in. It's also the case that today's retirees are not being paid out of their account. They're being paid out of they're being paid from the taxes paid, the payroll taxes paid from current workers. So that's why people worry that Social Security is not going to be around for them based on the solvency, because you need current workers to fund it. Okay. Now, the point is still taken. This is something people contribute to, so they're entitled to it when they're older. Okay. And the reason we have this social insurance system is to make sure people don't outlive their ability to work and take care for themselves. Okay, that's why we have the social insurance system, to make sure elderly people, retirees, don't wind up in poverty. My point about kids is kids find themselves living in poverty through no fault of their own. And there is no social insurance system that says, if you wind up in this bad state, then society will take care of you. And that's really the promise of Social Security. So it's more extending that concept. But the question underscores why the politics are what they are, which is that people really feel entitled to Social Security because they paid into it. And these kids have no claim on any money other than being born in a very wealthy society.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So this is a general question by Travis Conger, and he said, what's been learned about the effectiveness of COVID economic response policies by comparing different countries, and especially related to birth rates, and general government economic policies that can be evaluated by comparing countries related to fertility rates?
So another great question. In terms of the impact on fertility rates, again, just from survey evidence from Europe, it looks like people are feeling the same as they are here, which is that they're feeling like they have to postpone or abandon their plans to have kids. So it seems that people are affected in the same way. I think, the most sort of clear comparison with how different, European countries versus the US have dealt with supporting businesses is in the US, we provided for out of work workers primarily through extended unemployment insurance and enhanced unemployment insurance systems. And a very clear comparison has been drawn to a lot of European countries that instead more directly paid the businesses to maintain payroll. We did some of that in the US too with the PPP, but it is true that Europeans countries generally did more preserve the employment relationship as opposed to provide for unemployed people. I'm actually more favorably disposed to the way the US handled that particular element because, as I said, there's going to be sectoral reallocation from this process. And some jobs that were there in February are not there now, and they're not going to be there in April. So I actually think it makes more sense to keep people whole than try to preserve economic employment relationships that are being displaced by the change in habits that are likely to be with us for some time.
Thank you very much. I think that's about all. We've reached about the end of our time now. So first of all, I want to thank Dr. Kearney for giving this excellent talk. This has been fascinating, and I've really enjoyed it. And I know from all the comments that I've seen on the Q&A that people have. Everyone has enjoyed it. I also, of course, want to thank everyone for coming to it, all the students who have asked these excellent questions, and for people who have just been listening and thinking about what Dr. Kearney is saying. Finally, of course, I want to thank our sponsors, IBC and Commerce Bank, who without their support, we wouldn't be able to bring excellent speakers like Dr. Kearney to campus, either virtually or in person. So thank you very much, and we're really happy that you came.
Thank you, and thanks for all the great questions.